Well, I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar, Facing Our Forest Crises with Faith and Action. As you may know, today is World Water Day, designated by the United Nations, and yesterday was the International Day of Forests, and so it's more than appropriate for us to be here because forests all over America, North America, and the entire world are in crisis. Severe crisis, and it's not solely the responsibility of forest experts, environmental activists, or even, shall we say, the Lorax, to sound the alarm, to get to work addressing this, because it's all of our responsibilities. And especially in my opinion, it's responsibility of people of religious faith and spirituality to get engaged in this work in significant, persistent ways with heart and spirit, our hands, our heads, and our voices. I'm the Reverend Tom Carr. I'm a recently retired pastor of American Baptist churches and part of the National Religious Coalition for Creation Care that is hosting this event along with the John Muir Project of the Earth Island Institute. And I'll be moderating this program along with the wonderful work of Rachel Fazio, who is a lawyer and works with the John Muir Project, and she is responsible for all this amazing technology that makes this important time together possible. And we are thrilled and we are blessed to have three amazing forest experts who have committed their lives and expertise to studying climate change and forests and ecosystems and advocating for forests, life and health. Bill Moomaw, Dana Smith, and Chad Hanson, with some others who will be offering prayers and reflections. But before we go any further, I want to say once again that you're invited to use the chat room function on your screen if you'd like to put your name and organization that you're part of and where you're from. And then a little bit later, not too long from now, to raise questions for the forest experts as they make their presentations. And I'll introduce those folks in more detail in a few moments, but you might be wondering why we spiritual people or people of a variety of religious faith are interested in and concerned about forests. Well, there are many, many reasons to be sure, and our three forest experts will talk about one of those, the material, essential nature and role that forests play for all of life on Earth, and our absolute need to preserve, conserve, and restore healthy forests for the sake of all life, human and other than human. And we also come because, as the Jewish and Christian scriptures tell us in Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and those who live in it. And so creation, all of creation is God's, who is creator and lover of life, the one who is known by many names and no name. And those same scriptures also point to the primary human vocation and role, which is to cherish and take care of all that is God's. As we read in the second chapter of Genesis, and God put the Adam, the human being, in the garden to tend and to care for it. There is the gift of creation, of which we are all a part, and our responsibility to create a way of life and living that is in harmony with all of life through the practice of reciprocity, which is essential for the mutual enhancement of all life. And we come, at least I come, because I experience again and again a sacred presence in forests, as in all life, which elicits awe and wonder and joy. Because there's a sacred, divine presence within life, within human beings, within forests and trees and animals, birds, fish, sea, water, everything, all life, which so many of us experience profoundly. And we do so in forests, reminding us that the sacred, the divine, is within the whole created universe. And so nothing in creation is an it, or an object, or a commodity for our use. Creation is not here to serve us. We are here to live in a reciprocal relationship with all life because there's a numinous presence within and through all existence, and all beings are interconnected, intertwined. We are kinned kin. We're all in relationship one with another, and we share a singular story, which is two stories. The external story of forests is what our panelists are going to talk about. Absolutely essential, that outer story, but there's also an inner story. That sacred spiritual presence within all existence. And so forests have both stories to live and tell, and so do each and every one of us. And from this one story arises the questions that I hope that all of us have been pondering or will ponder and act upon. What is our role as human beings? How do we human beings live as an integral, essential part of the story? And what is our moral and ethical call to act in our relationships with forests, especially today, as they and we face crises? I would now like to introduce the Reverend Dr. Margaret Bullitt Jonas, who will lead us in prayer. Margaret is an Episcopal priest who works on she's worked on creation care for decades, but now she's working on creation care, particularly with the Episcopal diocese throughout Massachusetts and the Southern New England Conference of the United Church of Christ. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Tom. Greetings, everyone. I invite you to join me in a spirit of prayer. Blessed God, creator of earth, sea, and sky, and of all that lives, your love sustains the whole creation. We give thanks for the oxygen you breathe into our lungs through the forests, trees, and green growing things upon which our lives depend. We lay before you our sorrow, grief, and outrage at the assault on the world's forests, these sacred cathedrals that shelter countless creatures, clean the soil, water, and air, and reveal your glory, yet are being desecrated before our eyes. Give us the will to protect our lands and forests and to protect the health of human communities, particularly environmental justice communities that bear the brunt of toxic air pollution. Kindle the fire of your spirit within us, that we may be bold to heal and defend the earth. Pour out your blessing upon all who work for the good of this planet, our common home. We pray in your presence and in the name of all we hold dear. Amen.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you. I'm now pleased to introduce Frederick Kruger. Fred is the executive coordinator for the National Religious Coalition for Creation Care. He does so much for the sake of God's creation in the United States and all over the world. Fred, thank you for your leadership and this time that you'll share very briefly the mission of the NRCCC. Fred.
Thank you, Reverend Tom, and thank you to all of you for attending. I'll introduce just three central dimensions to our coalition. And I think the first one, which is unusual, is that we're vertically integrated. What that means is that we can work from the local level to the state level, to the national level, and the congressional level as well. Now, let me give you an example of what this means. In West Virginia, there was a hope to develop the first federally mandated wilderness area. And we were invited to help develop this. And so we developed a statement of the spiritual values of the Monongahela National Forest. And we took that statement that we developed to the local religious groups across the state. And those religious organizations, the churches and the synagogues, they took it to their legislators, The legislators took it to the Congress, and now we have the federally mandated Monongahela Wilderness Area. And that shows what religion, when it's engaged, can accomplish for the people. Now, we also have something different from most organizations. We've developed a biblical ethic of creation. And it's a very simple ethic, thanks to Rabbi Warren and Reverend Owen, who crafted that. And it's this, in the spirit of the scriptures: the earth is God's and all that is in it. Therefore, thou shalt not destroy the earth, nor despoil the land thereon. This ethic allows us to address every issue, from climate change to plastics, to ocean issues, to forests, to wilderness, to biodiversity. There's nothing that we cannot address because of this ethic that has been crafted and which now has to ripple across this land, so that religion is engaged in the challenges of the environment. And for those who would like to see it displayed, there it is. Remember it, because there's these three key dimensions. But we also have something else that's unique. We have developed a protocol. And that protocol is really simple. We're not ecumenical, remember. Instead, we're the exact opposite. We ask every person to reflect the fullness of their religious intuition and apply it as deeply and as profoundly as they can. That's part one. Part two, though, is respect the responsibility of every other person to do the same thing. Then we remove all negativity, all complaints, all crankiness. It just doesn't exist in our organization because it's prohibited. And the third thing is, let's stick to the issues of ecology. And with this formula for 20 years, we've never had a dispute. We've never had an argument. We've never had a situation that was divisive. And we take a message somewhat from Wendell Berry, who was one of our participants, because we host the National Prayer Breakfast every year. And he mentioned the importance of affection, to like each other, to get along with each other, to cultivate that harmony and rapport that allows us to work together and accomplish all the goals that we've set forth. So that's a little bit of an introduction to the National Religious Coalition and why it has been growing and becoming increasingly effective. So thank you very much, Reverend Tom, for giving me a minute here. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to introduce Alan Johnson. Alan is the director of Christians for the Mountains. He's a person of deep faith and practice. He is part of the NRCCC, an activist for the mountains and forests and life, and has a deep and abiding love for all creation. So Alan is going to offer us a brief prayer.
Let us pray. Holy God, creator of all, we gather together to invite your presence. We thank you for your gift of forests. Thank you for the trees that give us nourishing fruit and nuts. Thank you for trees that provide cooling shade. Thank you for trees that provide wood to fashion for human needs. Thank you for trees that give us oxygen to sustain our lives. Thank you for the beauty of trees, and thank you for forest ecosystems that nourish life. All praise be to you. Yet we confess that our human species has not served your forests well. We have destroyed much of your forests, while also using many forest products wastefully and selfishly. In this, we sin against you. So we gather together in repentance for seeking your wisdom and inspiration so that we can advocate in action, wise action, dedicated action for your forests. May you guide and empower us to this, your holy task. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Alan. Thank you. We now come to hear the knowledge and the wisdom of our forest experts who will share with us. And during this time, I want to remind you that the chat room is open for your questions, and we hope to get to as many as we can in the 10 or 12 minutes we have set aside for a Q&A after our forest experts have spoken. And the first person that we'll hear from is Dr. William Moomaw. And before I introduce him, you're going to need to know that late last week, Bill was called away to work in a place that has no internet access today. And so he graciously recorded his remarks in a video recording. Bill is a Ph.D. Is a professor of international environmental policy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University, where he founded the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy, the Tufts Climate Initiative, and co-founded the Global Development and Environment Institute. Has co-authored numerous reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's of course with the United Nations, including chapters on greenhouse gas emissions reduction and renewable energy, as well as major publications on climate change and pro-forestation. So we are grateful, Bill, who has recorded his remarks for us.
Great. I will start that in just a minute. Fred, there is a request that you type into the chat the NRCCC biblical ethic. So
Sure.
I'm sure people would appreciate that. Thanks so much. All right, without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we will meet Mr. Moomaw.
Major greetings. I'm Bill Moomaw. I'm a climate scientist, and I want to thank the Coalition for Creation Care for organizing this event. I'm a physical scientist who has been working on climate now for 32 years. And I want to share with you some of the thoughts that I've had about forests and why they're important. First of all, we're facing two major, I call them emergencies. One of those, of course, is climate change. And the second is the accelerating loss of species on Earth. The Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, a little over a year or so ago, published a report estimating that by 2100 we could have lost 1 million species. And people are not aware of what those species are and why they're important. In fact, many of them we will never see, and yet we will experience the benefits from their existence every day. So let me start by just saying that a forest is not just a bunch of trees. A forest, a true forest, is a very complex ecosystem consisting of anywhere from hundreds to thousands, tens of thousands of species. There are different species of trees, different species of other plants, ferns, and other things. There are lichens, there are fungi, there are birds, there are mammals, there are insects, there are worms, there are bacteria, and all of these together create what we think of as a forest. A tree plantation is nothing more than a row crop, and I'm sure that Dana Smith will probably have something to say about that. The role of forests in the operation of the planet is basically primarily to manage the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere, because trees absorb carbon dioxide and turn it into wood. Half the weight of wood is carbon that came from the carbon dioxide. And also, just to be this absolutely remarkable, complex system that we benefit from in many other ways. Up to a quarter of the pharmaceutical beneficial drugs that we have come from plants, many of them forest plants. Forests, of course, supply wood and paper products, and that's part of the problem. We're cutting down too many forests in order to supply those products. And forests play this incredibly important climate moderating role. Forests are the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. They probably host something like 80% of all the species on land. As we manage our forests to keep them relatively young and never allow them to reach an older age, we're foregoing vast amounts of carbon storage. Forests could be storing twice as much carbon as they now do, but do not because of the management practices we have. In the United States, according to the U.S. Forest Service, just 7% of our forests are more than 100 years old. And yet they're composed of tree species that can live for 200, 300, in some cases 400 or 500 years. We've even found a few remnants of those here in Massachusetts and in New England. And they are, those trees and clusters of trees are remarkable to behold. So, so there are really three reasons why we should be concerned about forests. One of course, is their climate role in addressing the climate emergency. The second is their role in protecting us from the biodiversity catastrophe that we're facing. And the third one is more of a human-centered one. The value that forests have for us as people, physically, mentally, and for many people spiritually. It is remarkable, the research that's showing how beneficial walking in a forest is, or what the Japanese call forest bathing, is to the mind and the body. And one of my colleagues, Susan Massino, who's actually a neuroscientist, informs me that her research and others shows that there are actually physiological changes that take place in the brain, and we know there are physiological changes that take place in measurements like blood pressure and other factors, stress hormones, all kinds of things are decreased when we go for a walk in the woods. Secondly, what is the biggest threat? Well, the biggest threat is the cutting down of our forest for two things. One is to expand land for agriculture and for urban use, when in fact we could be intensifying agriculture, and we should be in-building rather than extensively outbuilding our cities. The other loss is occurring because the forestry industry, like every other corporate enterprise, thinks it has to keep growing. And to keep growing, it keeps trying to create demand for wood and paper products. And you'll hear more about this in a moment, but the latest fad is to eliminate coal, keep those coal plants operating by having them burn wood instead. That's terribly inefficient. It's far more polluting. and it is leading to massive destruction of our forests. Another claim is that we should build a lot more of our buildings with wood, and there's a new manufactured wood, basically, where wood is taken and formed into what's called cross-laminated timber. And the argument is that these wood buildings would be far less carbon intensive than buildings built of steel and concrete, and we should build tall buildings that way. Turns out that this overlooks a very important factor, which is that harvesting in the United States is such that within the first year, sometimes within the first few days, but if you look at it over the first year, something around 1/2 of all the wood that was in the original trees ends up in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And the reason for that is that the branches are not useful for making wood, and so they're often burned either on the site or they're burned at the sawmill where wood is processed into wood. Not all of the wood that's processed makes it into the boards, into the lumber, because of sawdust and everything. And so roughly half of that is emitted. A study by the U.S. Forest Service shows that in the United States, excuse me, 85% of the emissions from forests come from the harvesting process. Only 15% come from forest fires, insect damage, wind damage, and land conversion. Those amounts that are lost in processing just aren't counted usually. Tara Hutterberg, who's a forest ecologist at the University of Idaho School of Forestry, and Beverly Law, who's at the College of Forestry at Oregon State University, and I and several other people published a paper last year showing that in Oregon, when the forestry industry began in 1900, and for the data we had through 2015, 115 years, that of the original carbon that has been harvested in 115 years, 65% of it is in the atmosphere today. Just 19% of it is in long-lived wood products, and 16% is in landfills. So we have this huge legacy of carbon dioxide from forest deforestation and harvesting, and even sustainable forest management that we have to remove. So we can't count on trees to just grow and absorb the carbon from fossil fuels to be net zero carbon by 2050. We have to make up for all of this extra. Roughly 1/3 of all the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is from land use change, primarily from forestry and deforestation. Now, what is the most effective way of doing this? Well, you hear a lot about, well, we're going to plant 1 trillion trees. That'd be great. That would add about 1/3 to the number of trees on the planet. Except imagine what this will be. We will plant the trees we want to cut down. We will not plant forests. We will just plant tree plantations. And so this afforestation, as it's called, is also not going to work because the mortality rate of young trees is very high. And secondly, the amount of carbon dioxide they'll absorb in the coming 3 decades, which are critical, will be very, very small. Even reforestation, which is always a good idea after we've harvested a forest, to have it regenerate, either primarily by natural means, that's the best way, but that's slow. And so some colleagues and I were thinking about this, and we realized that no one seemed to be taking into account the fact that this something like 3.6 billion tons extra that forests are removing from the amount that they actually use to build wood is coming from growing trees, from the trees that are already growing. And if we were to allow more of our forest trees to continue growing, that's what will remove additional carbon dioxide in the coming years. And the fact is, we could probably double that amount of removal from what it is today. We've given that a name because it didn't have a name. We call it proforestation, and it's it's basically growing forests to achieve their carbon accumulation to the maximum they could under the existing ecological conditions in which they exist. And so that will be this climate, the changing climate, and everything else. So with that, let me just close by saying we really do need to have a change in thinking. We must not forego all of this potential carbon dioxide removal by forests. And on a personal level, we need to continue to enjoy the wonderful benefits that forests bring to us personally.
Thank you so much, Bill. That's really amazing what you bring forth, and we're so appreciative. Our next forest expert is Dana Smith. Dana is the founder and executive director of Dogwood Alliance, an award-winning nonprofit working to advance climate action and environmental justice through mobilizing diverse voices to protect the forest and communities of the southern United States from destructive industrial logging. Dana is a leading voice connecting the dots between climate change, forest destruction, and social justice. She holds a law degree from Emory University, and we are so glad that you are here. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you so much. It's always an honor to be sandwiched in between two people that I consider to be heroes. One, Dr. Bill Moomaw, whom I co-authored a report called U.S. Climate, U.S. Forests and the Climate Emergency back in 2017. And on the other side, Chad Hanson, who I've known for about 25 years, who I've always felt to be a real kindred spirit and brother on this journey of forest protection. I'm gonna share my screen here. I think I can do that. Here we go. Awesome. Well, it's just one of the things that I was asked to speak about. I am the executive director of Dogwood Alliance. Work is focused in the southeastern U.S., but just as Fred was saying, our organization is also vertically integrated. We work at the local level, the state level, the national, and even the international level. But one of the things that I was asked to speak briefly about is why forests are important to me. And I decided to share a story with you that I don't always share, but I think it's relevant for this particular group. As a young child, I grew up in the rural southern US. I was a child in the early 70s, born in 1966. And I was always outside, always barefoot and outside as much as possible. And of course, being in the rural South, I had free ranging access to nature. I also grew up going to church every Sunday. And I was raised in an Episcopal church on the May River in Bluffton, South Carolina. And I remember very vividly as a young child really struggling to understand what I was being taught in church. The language was different. I was hearing the words, but I wasn't really fully comprehending what it meant. I was fearful at times of church when I would hear about the devil and hell and all of these things that I didn't want to hear about. So I remember very vividly as a young child feeling, confused and not really understanding and asking for God essentially to send me a sign and to help me understand what this was all about. And one day I was about 8 years old. It was a hot summer day. And as usual, I was out in front of my house at the edge of the forest picking blackberries that day. And it was sunset, dusk, just a beautiful time of day. And this monarch butterfly landed right in front of me on this blackberry bush. And the position of the butterfly was such that the sun rays from the western sunset lit up the back of the wings of the butterfly, like stained glass in the church, right? And at that moment, I felt this big, profound sense of love, a presence that was so large and so loving. And at that point, it was like a lightning rod, and it hit me that this was God answering my questions about what I was learning in church. And I essentially found God in the wings of a butterfly. And I tell that story because there would be multiple times throughout my life until I reached adulthood that sort of combined to create the space for me to recognize that my purpose in life is to be of service to, is to recognize the sacredness of life, the beauty that is gifted to us. And there is not a more important time than right now to be in service of nature, to speak to the value and the sacredness and beauty, and to lift up a moral call to action, because as we've already acknowledged here today, we are in fact in a moral crisis. So protecting forests is as vital as phasing out fossil fuels to solving the climate crisis. We will not solve the climate crisis without protecting. As forests grow, they pull increasing amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere and store it. They provide natural flood protection. They ensure an abundant supply of clean, fresh drinking water. They provide a for recreation and spiritual connection. As Bill was saying, they're known to make us healthier and happier, our health of our forest. So while forests face many threats, this graph shows the forest cover loss of tree mortality across the North America and across the US. And you can see that while there are many threats, climate change, drought, invasive species, pests, even urban development and conversion to agriculture or some other use, logging is the single biggest driver of tree mortality across North America and across the US. Logging is the leading driver of carbon emissions loss from US forests, with the largest emissions coming from the southeastern US, the place that I call home and where I work. The US is the world's largest producer of wood products. The rate and scale of logging in the Southeast is estimated to be 4 times that of South American rainforest. In addition, the amount of logging, over tens of millions of acres and of natural forests have been converted to single species commercial tree plantations that are routinely sprayed with chemical herbicides and fertilizers. It has brought to the brink of extinction entire ecosystems, like the longleaf pine ecosystem that used to be dominant across the southeastern US. So logging is not only destroying ecosystems, and creating carbon emissions, but the wood processing mills themselves release large amounts of air pollution, disproportionately impacting low income and communities of color. Our nation's most diverse forests are in the southeastern US, but they are the least protected. There's very little public lands in the southeast are owned, 33% national average, and there's virtually no regulation of logging. This is a map of the Black Belt of the coast of the southern US. The Black Belt is among the hardest hit regions of the southeastern US. It has the highest percentages of Black population in America. It's often called America's third world because of the concentration of poverty, and other indicators of socioeconomic stress. So we're talking about these rural areas that exist in the world's largest wood producing region, and we're not seeing a corresponding economic benefit in the communities where all of this logging is happening. I think that's a really important point to remember. Those who typically benefit at the local level from industrial logging are landowners. 99% of the land in private ownership in this region are owned by white people. In many of these counties, people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous people, can make up a majority of the population. So there's an inequity that exists with the forest industry in terms of who benefits and who pays the cost. And that is not unique to the forest industry. We also see this to be true in other industries like oil, gas, and coal. These same communities are the target of a new market for wood pellets as renewable fuel alternative to burning coal in EU power stations in Europe. Bill spoke to this a little bit about how the EU government is now burning wood and coal, and place impacted the most in terms of the amount of exports that are going to feed this market is the southeastern US, and it is very cities in the rural Black Belt of the South. This is adding increased pollution and corruption in communities that are already overburdened by both. And meanwhile, as Bill has pointed out, scientists warn that burning trees will make climate change worse, not better. It is not a climate solution at all. And we're seeing massive clear cutting forests along rivers in this area. This is rampant. It's unregulated legal logging job that we're seeing right here. This particular clear cut was linked back to the world's biggest wood pellet exporter, is a company called Enviva that has built now 4 wood pellet mills in North Carolina and many others across the South. These forests, aside from being some of the region's most diverse, are vital to natural flood control. And meanwhile, the flooding in these areas is getting worse. The Black Belt communities in particular are some of the hardest hit by recent extreme flooding that has been linked to climate change. This is in Robeson County, North Carolina, where we worked with a local community last year to stop a new wood pellet mill from being constructed. And in spite of statewide and local opposition, the state issued the permit, making it the 5th wood pellet mill to be approved in North Carolina. The poverty rates in Robeson County are 3 times the national average, and Native American and Blacks make up over 60% of the population here. So industrial law, and this is already at ground zero for global industrial logging. So if industrial logging were a way of bringing communities out of poverty, our communities down here in the southern US shouldn't look like this. But the wood pellet industry is continuing to expand, and in particular, targeting, we've noted, fortunately, low income and communities. But communities are fighting back. On the left, you see a picture of Belinda Joyner. She's in northeastern North Carolina. She has 2 big wood pellet mills in her community. She also has 3 big paper mills in her area. And here she is talking to a Politico reporter on a trip we did in this year, telling the reporter about story impacts of this industry. And she's been quoted as saying when she saw George Floyd and the knee on his neck, she said that that's how her community feels, that this industry is like a knee on the neck of their communities, that they can't breathe. They're getting sick and their communities are being destroyed over and over and over again by more and more of these dirty industries coming in. And on the right is my good friend, Reverend Leo Woodbury, in the left part of that picture. And my other good friend, Chief Parr, who's the chief of the Pee-Dee Indian tribe in South Carolina. And the Pee-Dee Indian tribe is working now to really establish forest in the wetland areas of the Pee-Dee watershed, not for logging, but to show a way of interacting with the land. And we're excited. In April, they're going to be doing a ribbon cut ceremony for a cultural center that they're building their forest land that started over the couple of years. So at the US and national level, forest climate policy is pretty much a mess. The EU, we're working to change the flawed energy policies that are driving the use of fuel and subsidizing heavily the use of southern forests as fuel for burning in power stations as renewable energy. And we're having some success. Maybe we can get to that in the Q&A. And as policies are largely focused on right now, like tree planting and wildfire prevention via logging, which Chad is going to talk more, and expanding wood products versus scaling up the protection of our forests from industrial logging. So one of the things that's really exciting about right now, around are starting to really mobilize at a grassroots level. And whereas normally, you know, policy gets developed sort of by policy experts and lawyers and scientists, it's also really important to listen to people on the ground, because that's where the political power is going to lie. If people are in their communities talking to their legislators and demanding action of them. It's important for us to start to think about how to develop policy from the ground up so that people are bought in and actually want to work for the type of policy that we want to see happen at a state or a level. We just recently worked with organizations across the South to develop the Southern Communities for a Green New Deal, and forest protection emerged as one of the top line issues for frontline communities that bear the brunt of the impacts of destructive industries. And what they want to see is very aligned with what Bill Moomaw and others in the scientific community are saying that we need. First of all, no more biomass or wood pellets. No more expansion of these types of dirty wood processing facilities in environmental justice communities. They want to see more protection of wetland forests from logging. They want to reestablish and restore forests, not through tree planting, but through really restoring native ecosystems. They want to see the forest industry held accountable for their carbon emissions and their impacts, just like we're holding others in the fossil fuel sector accountable for their emissions. They want to see a redirection of subsidies away from the logging industry and instead into their communities to support a nature-based economy and more public lands. They want some land reparations for Native Americans and Black Americans who have been, over time, land has been restricted through a whole series of regulatory policies and practices. And they want to manage lands at a community level in those areas that have been hardest hit by industrial logging. So I'm finished here, and I just talk a little bit about next steps. But this week on International Day of Forests on Sunday, we launched a national petition in partnership with John Muir Project, Friends of the Earth, Indigenous Environmental Network, and some local organizations targeting the Biden administration to hold the forestry industry accountable for its climate, biodiversity, and community impacts. So we'd love it if folks on this call would sign and share that petition. I think there's also a great opportunity for this group to communicate via a sign-on letter from the faith community to the Biden administration on forests, and to do meetings with the administration and with Congress. The Forest Service has opened for public comment right now, due at the end of April, on forests and climate change. And it would be awesome if folks on this call could submit comments to that. And then finally, just support and engage in local efforts on the ground in the Southern US, in the Pacific Northwest, wherever you are. We would welcome your participation in the work that we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dana. It's amazing work that you're engaged in. We're really so appreciative. Thank you for being here. Now I'm privileged to introduce Chad Hanson, who is the founder and executive director of the John Muir Project of Earth Island Institute. He is a working forest ecologist and has published dozens of scientific studies on forest and fire ecology, and is the author of 2 books, The Ecological Importance of Mixed Severity Fire, Nature's Phoenix, and coming out this spring, Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. He holds a Bachelor of Science from UCLA, a law degree from the University of Oregon, and a Ph.D. in forest ecology from the University of California, Davis. Thank you so much for being here, Chad.
Hi, I'm Chad Hanson. I'm a forest and fire ecologist with the John Muir Project. And I'm going to be talking today about the importance of protecting forests for climate change mitigation and some of the myths about forests, and particularly about wildfire in forests, that are getting in the way of us making the needed progress on that issue. First off, I'll just talk a little bit about how I got into this issue. I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada with my older brother, Kirk, in 1989, and saw the devastation from logging and clearcutting on national forests, all the way from Northern California through Oregon and Washington, all the way up to Canada. And it really affected me, and I just have felt called to protect national forests and protect forests in general ever since then. And so I've been working on this issue for about 30 years now. So one of the key things that's emerging from the science is that we have to do more than move away from fossil fuels in order to overcome the climate crisis. Getting away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible is essential, but it's not enough, because once we put the excess CO2 up there in the atmosphere, it stays there for a very long time. We have to protect a lot more habitat, especially carbon-rich habitats like forests, so they can pull that CO2, that excess CO2, out of the atmosphere and store it in the growing forests. And so what we call nature-based climate solutions are essential, and they're a necessity to overcome the climate crisis. And forests are the biggest part of that. In fact, protecting forests nationally and globally, that actually ends up being about half of the needed climate change mitigation to overcome the climate crisis. And so it is really, really important. It's a big part of the equation in terms of mitigation, but there are a number of harmful myths getting in the way of us making the kind of progress we need to make in terms of protecting forests, or what my friend and colleague Dr. Moomaw calls pro-forestation, protecting forests and allowing them to draw down more atmospheric carbon and store more carbon to overcome the climate crisis. And so I'm going to talk about some of those myths. The first one, and one of the main ones, is what I call the overgrown forest myth. And basically, this is this notion that we hear in the media all the time, usually from scientists who are funded by the United States Forest Service and also logging industry representatives, claiming that we need to remove a lot of trees from our forests through logging, supposedly because they're too dense, and dense forests burn much more intensely. And there are a number of serious problems with this claim. First of all, just for a little context, the United States Forest Service is in the commercial logging business. The agency, one of the main things it does, usually the main thing, is sell public trees to private logging companies off of public lands and make and generate revenue and keep that revenue for their budget. So it's really important to understand that when people are speaking for the United States Forest Service, or they're funded by the US Forest Service, they do have that financial interest involved. And that's important context. So one of the key things, one of the first things I'll mention that just to debunk this myth of overgrown forests, is that in every region of the US in forests, the current levels of forest carbon storage are much less than the biological potential for carbon storage. And that's mostly due to many decades of logging and clear cutting in every region of the country, in the East, in the West, in the upper Midwest. And what that means is, though, is that because that difference is so great, there's huge potential for climate change mitigation, because most of our forests can store a lot more carbon than they have in them now because of all that logging. One of the other key aspects of the overgrown forest myth is this idea that if you have dense forests, that dense forests have more fuel, and therefore they'll burn much more intensely when fires occur. And the US Forest Service and the logging industry and pro-logging politicians are using this myth to promote increased funding for logging, increased rollbacks of environmental laws, usually under deceptive euphemisms like forest health or restoration or fuel reduction, which have all just become stand-in terms for logging. And they're claiming that they need to remove a bunch of trees from the forest supposedly in order to curb fires. It turns out the science is strongly contradicting that. In fact, the densest forests usually burn less intensely when a fire occurs. And it all comes down to microclimate. dense forests have more cooling shade of the forest canopy cover. And so everything stays more moist in fire season in the understory. And in addition, when the forest has more trees, and especially more larger trees, it actually buffers the winds that drive the flames in a forest fire. And so for a number of reasons, denser forests typically burn less intensely. And in fact, when there's large down logs on the forest floor, that actually impedes the flow of the fire over the forest floor. And those large down logs soak up and retain huge amounts of soil moisture, like giant sponges. So in forests, things are oftentimes sort of counterintuitive. They're not as you would expect necessarily. And this is a figure from Zald and Dunn, 2018, that shows this relationship. The densest forests have the lowest fire intensity. And a number of other studies have found the same thing. I've conducted research on this too. The other one is this idea that if forests that historically burned relatively frequently, every 25 to 40 years perhaps, that if they haven't burned in 80 or 100 years or more, that they will burn much, much more intensely, again, ostensibly due to fuel accumulation. And we've researched that over and over again. In fact, there's been 8 studies published on that. I co-authored 2 of them, and they've all found that that myth is simply that. It's not true. Forests that haven't burned in the longest period of time have equal or lower levels of fire intensity when fires occur. And again, because of those microclimate effects. If they haven't burned in a long time, they usually have a higher canopy cover, more cooling shade, and higher tree density, and that is often associated with lower fire intensity. So bottom line, we don't need to worry about increasing natural disturbance processes if we allow our forests to accumulate more carbon and pull more carbon out of the atmosphere. The voices out there telling us that we can't do that are coming from logging interests, and that is actually counterproductive to our goals to mitigate climate change. The other thing I'll mention is that forest fires are driven mainly by weather and climate factors. My colleagues and I did the largest scientific analysis ever, the entire Western United States, and 3 decades of data. This is Bradley et al. 2016 study. And we found that forest fires are driven mostly by weather and climate, and you can't fight the wind with a chainsaw. So, logging is not going to stop forest fires that are driven by weather and climate factors. What we did find is that logging is actually a significant secondary factor, but not the way a lot of people think. Forests with the most trees removed or more trees removed and fewer environmental protections, they burn the most intensely. Whereas forests with the highest levels of environmental protection and little or no logging history had the lowest fire intensities, even in the same forest types. So logging does not curb fires. It typically makes them burn more intensely. And interestingly, that's also true of what the logging industry and the Forest Service sort of euphemistically call thinning, which is actually an industrial logging operation in the vast majority of cases, typically killing and removing upwards of 60 or 70% of the trees in a given stand, including many mature and even some old growth trees. And it turns out that in most cases, thinning actually increases fire intensity. Not always, there's a lot of moment. So sometimes they can burn at lower intensities, but they often burn and typically burn at higher intensities. So last, I'll talk just a little bit about the other key myth, which is what I call the catastrophic wildfire myth. And this is this idea that if a fire burns in forests now, it burns mostly at high intensity and it destroys wildlife habitat and the forests won't regenerate. What we're finding from literally hundreds of scientific studies now is that's not true at all. In fact, the largest fires are burning mostly at low and moderate intensity. This is the rim fire, 257,000 acres. Those red areas are the high intensity, and that is only 20% of the total fire area. This is the Wallow Fire of 2011 in Arizona, 565,000 acres, only 12% high intensity, those red areas. And this is common, this is typical. Even the biggest fires, they're mostly low and moderate, contrary to a lot of popular misconceptions about fires. And in fact, historically, forest fires, even in ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests, they typically had between 20 and 35% high intensity fire effects. So those high intensity patches are a natural part of the mix. They were mostly low and moderate. And that matters because it turns out high intensity fire, where the fire burns hot and kills most or all the trees, that creates one of the most ecologically rich and important forest habitat types, what we call snag forest habitat. And dozens and dozens of native wildlife species and plant species in the forest actually depend on snag forests, because many insect species like wood-boring beetles depend on fire-killed trees to reproduce. And the woodpeckers depend on the larvae of the wood-boring beetles, which they find deep under the bark of the fire-killed trees. They depend on those larvae for their food to survive. Dead trees are softer than live trees, so the woodpeckers can these, which they usually create 2 or 4 in a given year, and use the one that they like the best. All the other cavities they create provide homes for the dozens of other bird and small mammal species in the forest that have to have cavities to raise their young but cannot create their own, like bluebirds, nuthatches, flying squirrels, chipmunks, and many others. And so, in fact, in these areas that burn the most intensely, you often find the highest levels of native biodiversity, comparable to old growth forest in so many cases. And just for one example, bird abundance and diversity oftentimes is at its highest level in these snag forests. You know, interestingly, another aspect of the catastrophic wildfire myth is this notion that we have too much fire, or we have unnaturally excessive levels of fire in our forests. Everyone in my field, all the scientists agree that we actually have a deficit of fire in our forests, both in the West and the East and the upper Midwest. We have less fire now than we naturally had before fire suppression. So we don't have an overabundance of fire, and that's really important to understand. In addition, when fire does burn, even in a big fire, only about 2 or 3% of the tree carbon is actually consumed. And what that means is that all of the current models are vastly overstating and exaggerating the carbon emissions from wildfires, because they're typically assuming that 30% or 50% of the tree biomass is consumed and goes up into the atmosphere. And in fact, field studies are showing that it's nowhere near that high. It's only a tiny percentage. And the models also fail to take into account post-fire regrowth. In other words, they effectively assume that no carbon is being pulled out of the atmosphere by naturally regenerating forest cover after the fire. And that's simply false. What we're finding from study after study is that these forests are vigorously regenerating naturally after even the biggest fires. And this is an area of natural regeneration in the largest high intensity fire patch in the Rim Fire. And you can see hundreds of conifer seedlings and saplings per acre, and ferns and shrubs, wonderful, rich, biodiverse regrowth. This is 12 years post-fire in another large high-intensity fire patch. And some of these trees, this is all natural forest regrowth. Nothing was planted here. Some of these are already 15 to 20 feet tall at this point in time. And similar thing in another large high-intensity fire patch in the Rim Fire in the Sierra Nevada. That's me standing under a natural regeneration at 7 years post-fire. And so because of all this regrowth, and because the carbon emissions from fire are much smaller than people usually assume, forests become a carbon sink very shortly after even a big fire, usually within a decade or less. And because of the nutrient cycling that fire creates, and because of all that new regrowth that the fire spurs. And that's important to understand. And so it doesn't take long for them to recapture the carbon that was emitted, and then some. And our forests could be even bigger carbon sinks if we protected them from logging. And logging is actually the real carbon bomb, because most of the carbon in trees that are logged ends up in the atmosphere very quickly, mostly incinerated as slash debris or mill residues, oftentimes in biomass facilities. And then all that carbon is going into the atmosphere. And so we need to protect our forests from these destructive logging activities that are actually sending massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, like this clear cut in the Rim Fire, where the trees were incinerated at biomass facilities, sending all the carbon into the atmosphere. And including in areas that are mechanically thin, this is an area where most of the trees were killed and removed under the guise of thinning. And most of that carbon, again, went into the atmosphere. You have very little habitat left. It's really a very degraded system after that logging. And in fact, logging in US forests emits 10 times more carbon than fire and tree mortality from drought and native beetles combined. So logging, again, is the real carbon bomb. So what does it all mean? It means we need to be careful and actually very wary of any legislative proposals, whether it's coming from Republicans or Democrats, that are claiming that they're going to do more active forest management under terms like forest health or fuel reduction or restoration. Those in almost every case, in fact, every case I can think of are actually just industrial logging proposals. And what we need to do is support legislation, which will be coming out soon, to completely protect our public lands, like our national forests and other public lands, from logging, so that we get the Forest Service out of the commercial logging business, and logging subsidies, and acquire more private forest lands, especially in regions of the country that don't have many public lands, like the Southeast, and redirect logging subsidies into true green jobs. And that's where we need to go. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time for a couple of questions, if there are questions for our panelists. But one of them, what's that? One of the questions is what's new in the past few years on forestry and climate?
Okay. Well, I think that one of the most exciting things that's happened on forests and climate in the last few years, actually two. One, the paper that Dr. Moomaw mentioned on proforestation, which he's the lead author on, that was published in 2019. And that's a real watershed moment, honestly, in terms of nature-based climate solutions and getting a lot of people, not just in this country, but all around the world, to understand that protecting forests is not just something that can help mitigate climate change. It's absolutely essential. And not only that, but it's a huge part of the mitigation equation. So that was one. The other one was a letter from over 200 scientists, nation's top climate scientists and ecologists, was sent to Congress last year, saying that we need to treat forest protection as basically a co-equal part of climate change mitigation, along with getting away from fossil fuels. And so that was a really key development. There's never been a scientist letter like that before previously. So I feel like there's something really, really important happening in terms of the evolution of our thinking on this. We just need to get policymakers to start paying attention more quickly.
Yeah, I would agree with Chad. I think the science is evolving quickly in this space, and the emergent science is really pointing in the direction of that we need to keep it in forest standing as possible. I think the other thing that's happening is that, picture level nationally, we're recognizing that we need to listen to the science, but we also need to address deep inequities in our society. And the issues around forests are intersectional. And as I was saying earlier, scientists are saying we need to communities, what those are that communities are defining for themselves on the ground, those who are most directly and profoundly impacted are moving us in the same direction. And at the same time, we have a legacy. The US is the largest consumer and producer of wood products in the world. We have a legacy of industrial logging that is institutionalized across all levels of government. And it's the kind of transformation and the kind of rethinking that we're talking about doing on this call, is new thinking. It's like forward looking, and it's not the norm at this point. And in fact, there are a lot of folks who are vested and have financial interests in the current status quo that are, putting up all these myths about trees are renewable, and we can plant enough trees to get us out of climate change, and we need markets to make sure that we still have forests, because if we didn't have markets for wood, nobody would be growing trees and everything would be turned into a Walmart or a parking lot, which is just not reality. But that's the myth that keeps this industry sort of relevant. What we see, this industry actually getting away with a lot of greenwashing. And a lot of people into it because they're not as privy to the recent science or to the impacts of what people are feeling on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to respond with two short stories. One, both coming out of United Nations sessions, one with a delegate from Indonesia saying, you know, the monkeys are attacking our villages. Why were they attacking the villages? Because they were cutting down the forests and the habitats to the point where the monkeys, the chimpanzees, had nowhere to find food. And it was not only were the forests being destroyed, but the species habitat was being destroyed as well. The second brief story is about the world's first environmental refugees, which is in Micronesia. And I met with a delegation from Kiribati, and they said, what's happened as the world's first environmental refugees is the water has entered the ground system and salinized the water for our fruit trees. And our survival depends on fruit trees. And, you know, we've been talking about forests as a US issue, but it's really local, national, and global destruction that we need to think about. And that's impacting climate change. So what happened in Kiribati is the water salinized underneath the fields and all the fruit trees died. And so they had no fresh water. So they are sending their young people to New Zealand to recolonize because of the destruction of the fruit trees of Kiribati and their food systems. So it's all interconnected.
It's all interconnected. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Warren. I want to, because I'm kind of the timekeeper here, but I'm going to combine a couple of questions. And that is, what is the most important action that citizens can do to help and preserve forests? And then what would be, how can you get involved on a local level? And I'm just going to ask that for both Dana and Chad.
You want to go first, Dana?
Go ahead. I'll follow you again.
All right. Yeah, I mean, these are great questions. I think right now, just at the national policy level first, we need more than anything, we need leaders in Congress on forest protection and protection for public forests, protection for private forests as well, and to end the logging subsidies. We need leadership on those issues. Right now, you know, one of the key things, and this is kind of what I was getting to in my presentation, the logging industry and its allies in Congress, and some are Republican and some are Democrat, they're promoting logging ostensibly as a forest health measure. So any legislation you see that promotes itself as forest health, it's pretty much a logging bill. You know, usually they're using restoration as a euphemism for logging, fuel reduction, even though logging actually increases fire intensity. So logging does not reduce fire, doesn't curb fires, it actually makes fires burn hotter. And so we need members of Congress to take a leadership role and actually call out these myths and work with organizations like Dogwood Alliance, like John Muir Project, and many others in pushing back against this. At the local level, I think there's a lot of things that Dogwood Alliance is doing, John Muir Project is doing, and lots of other organizations. And certainly we can have that conversation if people want to reach out, and we can, you know, talk about some things that people can do.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the most important things I would love for people to walk away from this recognizing is that we need a policy sea change around forests in the US at every level of government. So ordinances at the local level. I know there's an ordinance in Conway, South Carolina, where they've restricted development in wetland forests, and we're looking at the potential of organizing at a local community level around, you know, protecting and restricting logging in wetland forests, all the way to the state level and to the federal level. So as Chad said, and I think this is really important, we need champions. We need folks at every level of a government who are gonna recognize the importance of forests for communities and for the climate, for biodiversity, and how critical it is to the future of our planet. And there are no jobs on a dead planet, right? And so how critical this is, not just for the health of communities, but also to the local economies. I mean, outdoor recreation, as an example, generates 5 times as many jobs as the forest industry nationwide. In the southeastern region alone, it generates 119 billion more to the southern economy. But where there's heavy concentration of industrial logging, outdoor recreation is restricted. Where you don't have access to public lands, outdoor recreation economy is restricted. So it's as important for the economy of these rural areas as it is for climate and for biodiversity. But the point being that every level of government matters, and we need people talking to their representatives.
Thank you. Thank you, Chad and Dana. And there are several other just wonderful questions, but again, we want to hold to our time. But that's a good way to look into it, because the webinar is intentionally named "Facing Our Forest Crises with Faith and Action." And so we realize that each one of us can and will take action to protect, preserve, and restore forests, in their own way. Perhaps like you might have read about the 25-year-old Jacob Fillmore from Canada, who is in the midst of a 12-day fast now, at least, to end clear cutting in Nova Scotia. That may not be your thing, but that's one action. In addition to what you were doing or thinking about doing, we're asking you to consider at least 2 actions. And one is to consider signing and then acting upon what we're calling our pledge to pray, teach, and act to preserve God's forests. I don't know, Rachel, are you able to put up those slides?
Let's try it. At least
Okay.
you know how to shut me down if it doesn't go well.
Do as many of these actions as possible, personally, family, leadership of your community. You can go to the next slide.
Yep, it's just a 5-second delay.
Yeah, that's right. Spend time in forests and be open to God's working in them. Discuss, teach, preach about the forest crises and others. Offer information on the ecological, economic, and spiritual interconnections. Pray on specific forest protection. Support forest land trusts in protected areas. Offer information. Oh, there I got that. Reduce use of paper and other wood products and use recycled paper products. Promote and use alternatives to chip milling for heating and other energy forms. Yeah. Host forest forums and protection solutions. Advocate to elected officials. Sign the NRCCC letter urging Congress to protect forests. And I'll get to that in just a second. Give daily thanks for all the gifts from God through forests. This pledge will be available to download and copy and use in your communities. You can see the link, and the link I think is in the chat room. If
I'll put it in the chat.
that was the plan. Okay, she's going to put it in the chat room. But secondly, we are strongly urging everyone to contact their congressional representatives and the administration about the forest crises. Because our forest experts, along with Rachel and those in the John Muir Project, they've created a letter designed to be sent to Congress, and you can get this in the chat room and via the websites listed. There's an awful lot of talk about among many members of Congress about doing something, and some of it is really good, but others, with green sounding, healthy forest bills, names are extremely harmful. So be in touch with the John Muir Project if you have questions on this. And that will also be in our chat room and the different websites and things like that. But this time I want to introduce the Reverend Dr. Owen Owens to bring us a closing reflection, which will be followed by a closing prayer from Rabbi Warren Stone. Owen is an ordained minister and for 3 decades was a director of ecology and racial justice for the American Baptist Churches USA. He has a lifetime of ministry in eco-justice and one of the founders of the National Religious Coalition for Creation Care. So thank you, Owen.
Well, this was such a rich time that I think I wanted to just lift up the protocol that we worked with over the years as one thing, because when you listen to each other and then you speak and pray out of the depths of your own faith and tradition, power is released. And when you respect other people, a strange thing happens. You become friends with each other. The second thing I think that's a power that was touched on again and again is to go outside. Most of the time, most of us spend all of our time in a car or in a building or shopping or sitting in front of a television. And when we go outside and open the book of nature, the Lord speaks to us and something always happens. A text that just sticks in my mind is from Isaiah, the prophet, when he says, cease to do evil, and in Hebrew, that means what breaks down, restores, and ruins. Learn to do good. And the word tov in Hebrew, which I take it is the word Isaiah is using and certainly referring to, goes back to Genesis 1. And there we see that the Lord created all that is. Now, there are many different understandings of the Creator, but if we go across the religious breadth in this group or across the world's religions, or we go across Enlightenment folks who have been disillusioned by the wars that religious folks have carried off against each other and everyone else, we see a deep kind of conviction that there is a power or force for good and that heals and makes whole. Now, in this discussion today, again and again, we heard the words, let's be honest. Let's tell the truth. We teach that to our children. How can you not teach a child to tell the truth? Lying takes us all down because it takes us away from reality. And we have to face the truth that we are not harvesting the trees throughout the world. We are cutting them down. And we are destroying the ecosystems, not just in the United States. The forests are going down all over the whole planet. And we need to change. And so Isaiah says, how do you do that? You learn to do good. You pay attention. You stop unmaking creation. You begin to seek to how we can restore that which was here in Pennsylvania. We've struggled with here at this retirement community, Kendall Crosslands, how we would bring a little bit of Penn's Woods back. And the first thing you discover is once it's been logged and farmed for 400 years, nobody knows what it was like. You have to dig bits and pieces out, but you can get little ideas of what it was once like. And of course, a forest is always particular to a given hill, to a given piece of land. And then we've loosed the COVIDs on the forest before they ever hit us. All these diseases, all the insects. I look at our forest and I ask myself, how is it possible to bring something new into being? But one of the things that, speaking now as a Protestant and a Baptist and a Methodist, that I've learned over the years is that when people pick up the task that Eve and Adam are given to be caregivers, as in our religious coalition for creation care, and we start out and we learn and we make mistakes, but the scientists will teach us, and then we don't make quite the same mistake. And I'm going to close with a little story which continues to touch me. A year ago, we were planting native trees and shrubs along Bennett's Run, a little stream which we hope again someday will have brook trout in it. And we had a little section set out because we have a daycare center for people who work here, and the little children were there. And each had a tree and a little tag that they wrote their name on so that they could, it was their tree. And one little girl laid her tree on the ground, began to cover the branches in the little tree with dirt. And this 90-year-old woman knelt down with her and said, "Now, dear, a tree has its roots that go in the ground. And this little part of it it will become a trunk someday. And the leaves are here." And the little girl said, "Oh, I see." And a child with a tree with her name on it and with his name on it, those are growing now. And the children are growing. And we have to remember when we get discouraged that the power of the Creator has not gone on vacation. The Creator does not particularly love the fact that we lie and we cheat and we make money by destroying, and wants us to change. We can't worship God and mammon. We remember each of those little children, each child, each tree is a sign of hope for the future, and it will carry us through. We will change. We will work together. This world will become a little bit more good because we hear that voice speaking to us.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you so much. Now for our closing prayer, I'm pleased to introduce Rabbi Warren Stone, who is also one of the founders of the NRCCC. He's the founding chair of the Central Conference of American Rabbis Committee on the Environment and a national leader for decades on religion and the environment. Thank you, Warren.
So I agree with Owen. We are the caretakers of creation. In Hebrew, it is a tree of life to those who hold firm and those who embrace that tree of life. May we all take action. Sacred source of all life. The forest and humanity are one. Our breath comes from the forest. We are deeply interconnected. Our survival is rooted to the survival of the forest, the tree of life. In the spirit of creation, in the name of the one, holiness pervades all. The earth is yours. We are Shomrim. We are guardians. Sacred and fragile into our hands. The earth has been diminished before our eyes, man. Walk through the forest, Reb Nachman knew. The truth of creation, the myriad of life, can't you see? A reflection of you and you and you. Butterfly, honeybee, dancing gazelle, white-tailed eagle, fallow deer, fawn. If we don't shout out now, they will be gone. They will be gone. Forests and wilds are God's places. We share the breath of life, see creation disappearing. We are one and the same. We share a common fate. We are interconnected. Truth is truth. Don't you know we are on that endangered list too? Vision, boldness, the only way. God's might uplifts us. The Navi prophet knew. Might for right creation is us. For we are spinning in time and space. We are blue, green, fragile. The Holy One of time and space longs to see our courageous face. We are blue, green, fragile. The Holy One of time and space longs to see our courageous face. Let us protect forests and all creation. Amen.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you. And I want to thank all who have participated during our time together, and to each and every one of you for your commitment to forest, to Earth, God's planet, our home, and to all of life. And so may you now go in peace. Thank you.